It's Sunday, June 4, 2023. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to The Weekend Show, where we take a deep dive into the news of the week. You can support my work and get exclusive access to bonus content at patreon.com/5minute news. Joining us today is the Democratic strategist and founder of Third Degree Strategies, Max Burns. Welcome back to The Weekend Show.
Thanks so much for having me. No place I'd rather spend a weekend.
You're the best, Max. We got a lot to talk about today. There's been so much happening. I want to talk about the debt ceiling, obviously. The Senate kind of ratified that, so it's gone to Joe Biden for a signature. Kevin McCarthy is taking all of the glory, so we'll find out exactly why. The Senate, staying with the Senate, they passed legislation seeking to repeal the Biden administration's student loan relief plan. So I want to talk about student loans. And I also read about a secret recording that somebody might have made about Donald Trump kind of boasting about having classified documents after he'd stolen them and knew that they weren't, well, he hadn't declassified them. So there's those subjects and more that we will seek to tackle in the next hour, Max. And with your expertise as a Democratic strategist, I'm very interested to start talking about Kevin McCarthy. And Kevin McCarthy is currently kind of taking advantage of this moment because he is kind of seeking to score brownie points for getting this through Congress, despite the fact that it required a significant number of Democrat votes, that the Freedom Caucus and a whole bunch of others on the Republican side really felt that this was not the kind of deal that they should have agreed to, or that Kevin McCarthy should have agreed to. And so it's almost like nobody's happy with this, but it had to be done, and it got done, and McCarthy's trying to kind of reap all the glory. Tell us about how you analysed this process from the negotiation through to the vote, and obviously the Senate kind of had to do its job. How do you read this?
The big part of this that you've pointed out is that this was supposed to be in many ways sort of a victory lap for Kevin McCarthy's mature speakership. He made a lot of very strong promises on the day of the vote. He said worst case scenario, he expected maybe to lose 45 Republicans. They lost 71. And he also very boldly pledged to bring 150 Republicans to support the debt ceiling bill. That also did not happen. So what we come out of this seeing is a McCarthy that got what he wanted, but at an immense cost. I mean, there are now 71 furious Republicans. Any one of them, because of the deal he made to become Speaker, can now trigger a motion to oust him from power. And some, including Dan Bishop and Chip Roy, are actually trying now to build up a base to actually make that move and try and put Kevin McCarthy in a humiliating political bind.
The Republican Party has the potential to kind of split into kind of multiple factions, right? Because, of course, you've got the Trump or DeSantis route going on in the leadership space. And then in Congress, you're seeing the kind of MAGA Republicans, the Marjorie Taylor Greenes, and she was photographed hugging Kevin McCarthy a few days ago, and a lot of people were very angry about that. I mean, where do these allegiances lie, and who ultimately is going to come out on top?
Well, the challenge now going forward is this is essentially Kevin McCarthy's last hurrah as far as legislation. The Freedom Caucus has already said they don't expect our cooperation on anything else during your term. You're going to have to fend for yourself here. And it really makes it tough to get things done, because what you see is that a third of the Republican Party, about 71 people, is completely opposed to Kevin McCarthy. They want Trump reinstated as president. They want all of the MAGA policies put forward, and anything less than that, they will just obstruct, same as if it was a Democrat. And then you have this sort of McCarthy core of people who, working with Democrats, can get things over the line like the debt bill. But the problem is, in McCarthy's own agreement to become Speaker, he agreed that he wouldn't make Democrats essential parts of his strategy to win. And he just did that with this vote. And it's something a lot of Republicans have taken note of. And they're starting to ask whether he's really a strong MAGA Republican that should be the spokesman in the House.
I mean, he's not, is he? Let's be honest. I mean, there's some people are starting to call him a rhino. He really is very much out for himself. You know, he's one of those people that has an ego, and he enjoys the trappings of leadership, but without really kind of doing the work.
Yeah, I mean, Kevin McCarthy is many things, but a principled loyalist he is not. He's really survived in Washington by being a bit of a swamp monster, an empty suit that works for lobbyists, works for consultants, and shifts his views as times change. And what we see now is the result of that. It's weakness, not just alienating a lot of Democrats and a lot of middle America, but a lot of Republicans too. I mean, former friends of his like Nancy Mace essentially said he got rolled by Joe Biden, that he got beaten by a president who couldn't find his own pants. And that's what Republicans are willing to say publicly. I mean, I can't imagine what some of Kevin McCarthy's text messages look like.
Well, yes, I'm sure that a prosecutor will ask for them at some point in the future. Let's talk about Joe Biden and the way that he played this. Because, some of us were quite critical of Joe Biden in the early days of these negotiations. He seemed to be, relying on this kind of age-old bipartisanship that he's very fond of, that a lot of us have now we just feel that it just doesn't really exist, that desire for the two parties to work together. But he's quite old school on this subject, isn't he? And he really feels like there is hope. And he talks about it all the time, and he actually might have, for a mature gentleman, he kind of played everybody, didn't he, including me?
He did. I mean, having a 2-year extension on this, an essential freeze without a number, is a massive loss for Republicans. They know that. It's why they've been instructed not to talk about that part of the debt deal. It's why Kevin McCarthy's running around like a chicken on the hill, telling everybody who can listen that he made history, that this is a huge deal. And the reality is Joe Biden, I think, played this pretty correctly. I was critical in the beginning as well that he wasn't getting out to the American people, making this case directly to them. But to his point, if he had come out and said, this is such a great deal I'm making, we're really getting one over on the right, it probably would have locked out any kind of compromise like we got. And Biden, in this case, was willing to take the win that keeps the economy open, keeps people employed, and not get all of the fanfare in the run-up. And that's an element of discipline, I think, that you only get from doing these negotiations for 30, 40, 50 years.
And strategically, Biden doesn't gloat, does he?
No, he's never been. And I think that's also informed by the fact that he's not competing against a party that's fully functional, that you have so many fractured parts of the GOP that anything might break that into something that just can't work at all. And as much as Joe Biden wants to beat Republicans and has, he also wants to make sure government is still functional, and rendering it completely broken by really hammering Republicans down ends up hurting us in the long run. And with this deal, I mean, we're getting real concessions here.
Some people are not happy with the deal. Bernie Sanders didn't vote for it, said he couldn't vote for it, took too many things away from people that needed it. What's the deal with that kind of progressive arm of the Democrat Party who really feel like they've been sold a bit of a lie here?
Yeah, well, Joe Manchin definitely made that poison go down a little bit more bitter with his plan that was put in there to fund an oil pipeline, a gas pipeline in West Virginia that upset even some Republicans at how blatant it was. But it's true. I mean, this is a deal where Democrats took concessions. There are extended work requirements for social programs. There's been a slight cut to the IRS, which is going to upset people who think that people should pay their taxes. But one thing we've seen is that Biden really did involve the left from the beginning in the process, which, unlike the sort of infrastructure bill debate, you see now that result is much less actual anger. There hasn't been a lot of chest beating about fighting Biden or making him pay a price for this. People seem to think that they've had a room to complain. They've had room to put forward their proposals. And for now, it seems like Democrats are at least sticking together because they know this is the best deal they probably could have gotten.
What does this say about Joe Biden's age? All this criticism that the guy's senile and he's too old. I mean, it's not really criticism from the left. It's criticism from the right and the far right. And they create memes and they kind of weaponize this language. And unfortunately, tripped over a few days ago when he was just after he'd made a speech, tripped over a sandbag and joked about it and said, I got sandbagged. But, I mean, when I'm that age, if I fall over, I ain't getting up, right?
Yeah,
he got straight up.
I mean, the reality is Joe Biden's old. I don't think anyone's hiding that. I don't think it's possible for him to hide that he's not the guy he was in 1970. But, everybody falls. Every president is on video falling at least once. And few of them get up and then sign a 2-year deal to keep the government open and keep the debt funded. But I do think there is a risk here that Republicans have gone so deep in on this caricature of Dementia Joe that when he beats them so soundly that they can't even spin it, that really makes them seem like the incompetent people. And what we see from a lot of the MAGA base now is reaching out to party leaders saying, okay, Joe Biden has dementia. How did he just beat you this easily? And that's certainly backfiring for them. But this never had a long-term strategy. It's always been dog whistle attacks on Joe Biden from the start.
Well, it's unfortunate because Joe Biden is not a good public speaker. He has a speech impediment which he has overcome throughout his life, which obviously in kind of unnerving situations returns. We all know about the clinical aspect of these things. And he kind of looked like an old man even in the 1970s. Do you know what I mean? He's always looked old.
Yeah.
So the poor guy doesn't stand a chance. The thing that frustrates me about the criticism is that, what's their alternative when it comes to public speaking? Donald Trump. You know what I mean? He might have charisma, might, be able to do all this stuff, but he can't actually form a sentence. Like there is absolutely no substance to what he says. It's just racist dog whistles and reciting the same old tropes.
Yeah, I mean, you're basically left with the choice of letting the president walk up there at West Point and do the commencement, or with Donald Trump having a military commandant hold his hand and walk him gently up the ramp. I mean, neither one of these looks really great on camera, but it's a statement. If we're going to nominate and elect older Americans, we shouldn't be surprised when in fragile moments they behave more like older Americans.
Do you get frustrated as a strategist that we don't have younger, more kind of sprightly candidates, across all sides of the political spectrum? I mean, Trump's only a few years behind Biden. It's just, I guess because he's overweight, he kind of looks younger. That's often the thing, is if you're slim, you look older. Well, that's my excuse anyway. I'm sticking to that. But because, politics could be so different in the US if you had two guys in their 40s, or even their 50s. I mean, just the speed at the interplay and stuff could even get done quicker. Who knows? Yeah.
And I think, weirdly enough, that the GOP primary is going to show a lot of people that there's going to be a lot of younger candidates up on that stage who have no chance of dethroning Donald Trump, but they've got a lot more energy and they certainly look a lot more like the country they're trying to lead. The challenge is we've never really built an infrastructure for that, even in the Democratic Party. We've discounted and taken for granted young voters. We've disadvantaged and written off their political views, which are largely more left than the party in general. And we've said if you want a path forward in the party, you have to look a lot like Pete Buttigieg and put a very moderate centrist line through. Don't ruffle any feathers. You can't raise your voice about economic injustice. You can't raise your voice about immigration too loud. And it's really made it unappealing for a lot of younger people to engage. They don't feel like they're being heard. And even having a generational shift where those leaders are on the stage more than they are now would, I think, be a huge change, not just in how we talk about issues, but how we actually think about issues. And people are really ready for that.
The secret to politics, to political leadership, is authenticity, right? That's what they say all the time. You've got to be real, you've got to be authentic, you've got to bring something of yourself to it. And I worked as a special advisor in the UK and, and a media trainer to a few politicians. So I kind of got involved in some of this. And it almost seems like the candidates, those of us that have done that job, the people that we have to deal with often lack authenticity and they lack something of themselves. And, they're fine when you're like having a beer, but the moment you ask them to get up on a podium, they lose all of the kind of beauty that makes us all individual. Biden actually does have quite a lot of that. And he talks about, obviously, his family and the family that he has lost, of course, and his dad, and all this family stuff. And so he's actually has all those component parts. But when it comes to candidates generally, I mean, how important is it now that authenticity, how do they manage the authenticity without having to be silenced on certain topics and policy issues? Because that's going to be the thing that prevents people, as you've described, from kind of really taking this on in future generations.
Yeah, I think you described the problem every single consultant and strategist faces in this field, which is there's only so much you can work with a candidate to get them to where they are naturally. People lock up, they get tight, they start getting concerned about the polls or about what the party's going to say or what Twitter's going to say. And one of the big things we forget about Joe Biden is that he ran for Senate for the first time at a time when television mass media campaigning was only about 10 years old. So he's still deeply rooted in the declamatory retail politics style of the 40s and 50s, where you would go into communities, you would do barnstorm tours, you could connect one-on-one. And that's always been his biggest strength. The awkward fit for him is that so many of his advisors seem to worry that he's not able to do it. They lock him off from those one-on-one unscripted moments that have become so characteristically Joe Biden. And for younger people who are very comfortable talking directly to huge audiences on Twitter, on TikTok, on Instagram, it comes much more naturally to just speak in that same way. So in an interesting way, about 80 years later, we've come full circle to a new group of people who can talk really authentically about issues that matter to them, who can get really into the nuts and bolts of policy and still hold a big young crowd. It's not easy to make policy fun, but people like AOC, people like Max Frost in Florida do it every day.
Hakeem Jeffries is on my short list for, future leadership. There's something kind of magical about that guy. I like the way he often talks in rhyme as well. That's a whole new thing for Capitol Hill. What do you think about him? He's currently the leader of the Democrats in Congress, right?
Yeah, I think he's been phenomenal. I mean, it's quite an ask to take someone who's just stepped into that role and ask them to avert a national debt crisis almost immediately with a party that doesn't just dislike Democrats, they dislike people of color a lot too. Hakeem is a New Yorker like me. He's been one of our gems, and it's amazing that America's finally getting to see him, and as you mentioned, his rhymes as well. But behind all that and behind the delivery, there's a really fine policy mind and a really fine organizer. And I think one of the reasons you've seen so little Democratic dissension since he took over is he's working really hard on the one-to-one relationships you have to master in that field. And it seems to be working great.
What's things like there without Nancy Pelosi, post the Pelosi speakership? How have things changed? I mean, you talk about Hakeem kind of carrying much of the load, but she was such a kind of central part of all of these negotiations. And, she really, in hindsight, was one of the great politicians in American political history. What's it like without her?
Well, it's often surprising to remember she's still there. We see her walking around taking votes as a regular backbencher, which is kind of surprising. This iconic character in House history who, as to your point, is one of the greatest functional House speakers in history, who's managed debt crises multiple times. I know from speaking with the team here in New York that Hakeem was very closely connected to Nancy. I was talking to her very much about her experiences in this. And a lot of her mentorship still applies for a lot of the younger members of the caucus. Maxwell Frost, the millennial from Florida, is a close friend of Nancy Pelosi, something I think surprised a lot of people. But these younger candidates, these younger politicians are eager to learn the ropes. They want to be effective stewards of government. And you go to Nancy Pelosi if you want to learn how the House works.
It's annoying in a way that, young people are not just the future of American politics and in leadership, but they're the future of everything, right? And I have a lot of hope the next generation is going to kind of be the savior of humanity, because this generation is struggling. There's so much at play, and there's so much at stake. People like AOC, who you mention, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, it frustrates me that she is labeled progressive, and obviously the word is radical that's used by the right to describe her. Where I'm from, in the UK and in Europe, she is a moderate to all intents and purposes. Does it frustrate you as much as it frustrates me that she is labeled a kind of radical progressive when she's just normal?
Yeah, I mean, I'm more than happy to stand with her and call myself a progressive and her a progressive. Radical progressive is just unrealistic. I mean, we wear a tighter fitting political suit in the United States than in all of Europe. And it's sort of a sad reminder of what could have been had we spent decades building student unions, building labor as they have in Europe. You would have a strong class that is pushing for progressive politics. And what's essentially happening now with the Progressive Caucus is AOC and Rashida Tlaib and all those members are doing their best to try and build that up now in the 21st century. But they've missed out on half a century of sort of foundation building there. And it makes it a real challenge. But I wouldn't compare them at all to the progressives that are at play in Europe or anywhere else, really.
I mean, even that description of the squad is I mean, that's weirdly, that's kind of self-coined phrase, isn't it? Didn't they call themselves the squad? I just feel that to have this kind of, to separate yourself, to me it's division and it's not necessary, but it's just because stuff that is considered kind of normal liberal policies in the US are considered too extreme for the status quo. I mean, do you think there'll ever come a time where it all fuses and you don't see these kind of groups, these breakout groups?
I certainly hope so. I mean, it definitely feels like we're in a sort of realignment right now where both of the parties, to a bigger or smaller extent, are trying to figure out what they're going to look like over the next generation. And the real challenge there is you just don't have, as I mentioned, a lot of infrastructural support. In this country, progressive essentially means candidates who support policies the majority of Americans support. It just means supporting popular things. Better health care, student loan freezes, pandemic preparedness, a sane immigration system. These are, in any other country, just considered fundamental good government issues. But here they need a special label because it's become so distorted by money, by polarized media, by politicians that are playing more for their future jobs than for their current public service. And it makes it seem more radical than it is, when in reality, it's radical to not have recognized any of these things for decades.
And the big one you didn't even mention is climate change. I mean, it makes no sense to me that there isn't really any politician kind of leading the way with converting all of us, whether it be electric vehicles or putting solar on our roofs. I think I said on the show a week or two ago, who can have a problem with solar? Like, how did that become politicized? The idea of getting free energy from the sun. And I put a tweet out about that, and somebody replied, well, if we all used solar, then, we need the sun and we can't use up all that energy. And I was like, really? Is that what people think? The more solar panels in America, the less sun there will be to go round?
Well, we really haven't come that far from ancient Egypt, I guess. We're still sort of wondering where the sun goes when it's dark out. The climate issue is such a huge one, and it's one of the most baffling issues in this country as a strategist and as an American. I mean, you have every branch of the military for at least 20 years now has openly agreed climate change is not just real, it poses real security threats to military preparedness, to our coastal cities. You have businesses like Ford that are investing tens of billions of dollars building batteries and building green tech. You no longer have to be, it's not an anti-business position to support climate change anymore. The smart businesses are the ones that are making massive investments now and seeing those returns come back. It's only in this alternate world of political conversation that wanting to invest in businesses is considered anti-business. And that's a function of messaging. I mean, Democrats are timid on climate messaging, and they need to get over it.
We need to pause for our sponsor message, but we're going to come back and talk about student loan forgiveness, which has really had a kind of, in the same way that Biden fell down, this also fell down, but in the Senate. So we'll look at that next here on The Weekend Show. I've never been able to compost before. I've been keeping food scraps in a bag, which doesn't smell very nice. And then I got a Lomi. Lomi allows me to turn my food scraps into dirt with the push of a button. Lomi is a countertop electric composter that turns scraps to dirt in under 4 hours. There's no smell when it runs, and it's really quiet. And thanks to Lomi, I have way less garbage each week. That means it's not going to landfill and producing methane. Instead, I turn my waste into nutrient-rich dirt that I can feed to my plants. I feel so great knowing that I'm composting and creating soil instead of waste that I basically now have a limitless supply of dirt for my garden. If you want to start making a positive environmental impact or just make cleanup after dinner that much easier, Lomi is perfect for you. Head to lomi.com/weekend and use the promo code WEEKEND to get $50 off your Lomi. That's $50 off when you head to lomi.com/weekend and use promo code WEEKEND at checkout. Food waste is gross. Let Lomi save you a cold trip out to the garbage can. I'm joined by Democratic strategist Max Burns. The Senate passed legislation on Thursday seeking to repeal the Biden administration's student loan relief plan, setting up a pledged veto from the president. The relief plan, which would cancel up to $20,000 in federal student loan debts for tens of millions of Americans, has been tied up in the courts for months, while the Supreme Court ruling that could block the plan is expected early July. It's the latest legislative action against the plan, amounts to a symbolic show of congressional disapproval. Tell us what this really means in real terms, Max, because a bit like solar, and why I don't understand why anyone would be against it. I also don't understand why anyone would be against forgiving student loan debt. I mean, why not?
We talk about popular things that politicians don't back, and this is one of the biggest. Something like 78% of Americans support this. The way that you've seen this portrayed in the media and on the Hill, you would think Joe Biden is declaring all debt in America canceled. And in reality, this is a very narrowly tailored program. It offers $10,000 in support in forgiveness for loans so that people who are having to pay their loans now that they're restarting aren't absolutely crushed by interest and by the weight of the debt. And this all goes back to the pandemic, when we've had, for the past 3 years, student loan debt payments frozen. That cannot continue as the emergency's ended. The Supreme Court seems certain to end that. And this essentially just puts a burden back in the hands of American families. I mean, 16 million people have already been approved for this, and the only people standing in the way of them and their money is Republicans who don't like it.
I mean, let's just think about what it's like to have student loan debt for a minute, right? And to try and find a job where you've got enough fat in your salary that you can pay it off. And the fact that a lot of these loans have been passed from one debt agency to another debt agency, and they, the amount has risen because the cost of living is high and wages have not risen. So it's not anyone's fault. It's not the fault of former students that they can't afford their student loan debts. And arguably there was a time, certainly where I'm from, where further education, adult education, was free. You didn't have to pay for college or university, and now it's not the case. And I personally feel that it should be free because the country can afford it. Just look at military spending. No one seems to balk at that cost, which is gigantic, second only to Social Security. And yet, for some reason, students, to educate people, it's just beautiful to be able to educate people so that they can work and they can be smart and they can question things. We need to have a better level of education in America, and yet students are demonized. What's the philosophy behind that thinking?
Well, I think part of this is that this never got fully thought through when it was implemented. I mean, the idea of a student loan on a fundamental level somewhat makes sense. They wanted at the time to subsidize getting as many people into higher education as they could, but they never actually worked out the second part of that problem, which is then how do you control pricing? And what we've seen over the decades is that given this essentially unlimited source of federal loan money, colleges have responded by raising tuitions every single year to the point where this isn't creating economic opportunity for people by allowing them to go to college. You're actually burdening them with decades of debt, and that's going to restrict their ability to pick a job that pays well. They're going to feel really pressured to take the first job that comes along. It restricts their ability to move, to buy houses, to start families. I mean, the economic drag of this policy is clear. Nobody denies it. It's literally just politicians who say it would be too much of a handout. It would be too nice to these people to get rid of their debt. And wouldn't it make everybody else feel bad? But as someone who had student loans, no, I would love it. I don't want anyone else burdened down with that. It's a nightmare that dampens your whole view of being a productive person.
And let's be clear, colleges make a profit, right? A lot of them, they claim not to. They claim to be charities or, however they set it up, non-profits. But they make a profit. They do well. People are well paid.
Yep.
Certainly in leadership roles. Right?
Yeah, they're doing great.
They're doing great. I'm sure there's a scandal to come out about this. I mean, there's been a few at Liberty and a few others, and then there's the debt agencies that are making a fortune, right? So this is a kind of capitalist, kind of corporate system that is making people very rich, and the people that are having to pay the price are the students or the former students. And so if you look at it with that perspective, if the policy was presented with that perspective, do you think it might change the kind of culture of people that felt that no one should get a handout?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that people don't know about student debt that changes their mind when they learn it is that federal student debt is the only type of debt you cannot discharge in a bankruptcy. So even if you go to college, have a business, run into medical problems, have to declare bankruptcy, your student debt is going to follow you forever. And that's going to be garnished from your wages. It's going to be a burden on your economic production, in many cases, for the rest of people's lives. And in my mind, Democrats should be following people like Ocasio-Cortez, who point out that the problem is not that we're not excusing enough debt. It's the problem that we've built up and sustained this incredibly predatory education system that needs to be changed from the ground up.
Let's just talk about this culture of some Americans, not everybody, not wanting others to be supported. And, I mean, there's racism in this, there's xenophobia in this, there's misogyny built into this, there's ageism built into this. There's a lot here, and exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, I guess. How far back does that go, the idea that others shouldn't benefit? This idea that I pay my taxes, I don't want my money going to this person or that person, even if this person could be a doctor that ends up treating that person who's complaining about it in the future thanks to their education.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to imagine that there was a time back in early American history where everyone was patriotically paying taxes and working together. But I mean, some of the foundational events in our country are the Boston Tea Party and Shays Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion. I mean, all things about taxes and not wanting to share with other people. And those are more or less legitimate depending on how you think of it. But it doesn't change the fact that Americans have always felt very suspicious of anyone trying to take their money away. And what we see that result in is essentially a Republican Party today that has become incredibly good at immortalizing grievance. You look at this case that's going before the Supreme Court on affirmative action in colleges that will likely end affirmative action. The student who filed that case now says he regrets it, that he was resentful in the moment, that he doesn't like the box of worms this has opened up that he calls racist. But Republicans have seized that moment of resentment and stretched it out to become a policy that may last forever. And that's how this country's worst elements tend to occur.
It's quite baked in, isn't it? This kind of culture, because the people that are complaining invariably are Republicans. And the Republicans that I'm exposed to, one of their favorite conversations is, how do I pay as little tax as possible, right? That's their shtick. And yet, that Social Security is a kind of socialist program, and it, keeps people alive. The military is a socialist program, if you think about it. You give people a job, you pay them, you house them, you feed them, and you keep them safe. And obviously it's kind of transactional. And you also, house their families in many cases as well, and their kids. I mean, there's a whole infrastructure there for the military, and yet the Republicans are very much for the military.
Oh,
why the hypocrisy?
Very much. I mean, that seems to be, it is ironic in a way that one of the purest socialist elements of American society, where your housing, your medical, your employment, everything is run directly through the government and they negotiate for everything on your behalf, is the part Republicans love the most. It's the part they say works the best and needs even more money to get even bigger. And even though there are some problems in how that system's administered, no one is seriously saying, oh, this is evidence that this system doesn't work. People seem to understand the nuance when it's framed in that national security argument. But Republicans especially don't seem to see a good education as a national security issue, a sustainable energy grid as a security issue, a population that can actually afford to feed their families as a security issue. And all of those things run the same spectrum. It's just that we've put on a very narrow set of what is acceptable socialism in America.
The irony is that it's Republicans who wanted to bring troops back from war. They didn't want them in Iraq. They didn't want them in Afghanistan. Trump organized loosely the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Unfortunately, Joe Biden had to deal with the aftermath of that. But it's almost like we want all of this money for the military, but we don't want to actually use the military. So in a funny kind of way, they're just pretty much asking for a kind of domestic socialist program.
Yeah, it is comes back to the fetishism on the right for this sort of Praetorian Guard. I mean, I think they would love this idea of having a special presidential bodyguard that is specifically hired by the president, as Donald Trump has hinted at before, that is essentially unaccountable to anyone else in government. There is something about, I think, that hard-booted militaristic view that even if we're not using it, it feels good to have it. And that's something that maybe they should look at in therapy.
But they're not the ones who go to therapy, Max. We're the ones who go to therapy.
They're the ones who want to ban therapy and ban psychiatry like Florida does.
Yeah. But banning education and banning higher education and pulling books off of shelves and, stopping people having access to healthcare and all of this stuff. And they wonder why people like me refer to their policies as fascistic. It's like it's a very clever confidence trick, what they've done. They've sold the entire kind of Republican ethos as freedom and being free. And yet with each and every one of these sectors, it doesn't even come close to freedom. It is pure autocracy and fascism.
Yeah, I mean, that is the playbook, and it works with stunning effectiveness. I mean, not to date myself, but I came into progressive politics during the Bush administration after 9/11 and the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. And we saw that when you rally around freedom and bang that drum, you can justify a lot of anti-democratic, pro-surveillance, pro-authoritarian policies by telling people that they're going to feel more protected. And the underlying element of all this has always been control. If you restrict the inputs for information, you restrict what comes out. And the easiest way to avoid a discussion Republicans are going to lose is by just outlawing all the source material that allows you to have that discussion in the first place. And that seems to be working pretty well for Ron DeSantis in Florida.
Well, this lack of debate is something that frustrates me. You don't really, even in Congress, people do not debate each other as you've seen in the House of Commons in the UK. It is, someone makes a statement, then someone else makes a statement. And in fact, the only time there's really anything that gets close to a debate is when there is a lack of decorum and people start shouting at each other and someone has to kind of gavel it to try and quieten people down. I'm like, don't gavel it. This is good stuff. Like this is the very fabric of democracy when people really talk about it. But it's interesting how so many Republicans don't want to be interviewed. They don't want to be asked questions. They don't want to dig any deeper than just the top line, which invariably is 3 words.
Well, for the most part, that's because they're not actually educated on the issue at all. I mean, you see in the hearings they hold in the House, they become deconstructed postmodern grievance sessions about Hunter Biden and Joe Biden running a criminal conspiracy. And someone has to stop them and say, this is actually about trade tariffs. This has nothing to do with what you're talking about. And there is sort of this hesitancy to have any kind of meaningful debate. One of the reasons that both parties take over the cameras in the House from C-SPAN when they elect a speaker is so that they can point them down, and you can't see that when members of the House are debating each other, that chamber's totally empty. There's only 1 or 2 of them there and a couple of interns. There's really a sense of absenteeism about this, that they want to litigate this on TV for ratings and for money, and not so much to solve a problem. And that's something we're starting to see CNN embrace too, and it's getting to be worrisome for the whole media ecosystem, because if those outlets aren't provoking some kind of real debate, who is?
We have to take another quick pause for another sponsor. I'm thrilled that these organizations, small businesses in the main, are supporting this show. And then we're going to come back with Max and talk about the Department of Justice, who have discovered or have been given some secret recordings of Donald Trump boasting about his classified documents. Next on The Weekend Show. Now let's take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Paired. My partner and I are super competitive people, especially with each other. The other day we were going back and forth about who knew our relationship history better. So we took it to Paired. Paired, it's a relationship app for couples. You and your partner download the app, pair together, and every day Paired gives you questions, quizzes and games to have fun, stay connected, and deepen your conversations. You'll never believe what I found out about my partner through Paired. Apparently she really wanted to start doing yoga. I had no idea. The Paired prompt asked her what was the one thing she wanted to start doing this month. She said yoga, and now we're in a weekly class. It's simple and often hilarious. Each day, you get a quiz to play or question to answer. You cannot see your partner's answer until you answer yourself. It's been so funny to see how close our answers are sometimes, but then other times how different they can be. It's really made for some great conversations. Whether you're just a few dates in or have been together a long time, it's time to lighten the mood and have fun with your partner by using Paired. Head to paired.com/weekend to get a 7-day free trial and 25% off if you sign up for a subscription. Just head to paired.com/weekend to sign up today. Connect with your partner every day using Paired. A happier relationship starts here. Everyone knows how annoying cheap razors are. The cuts, the irritation, the frustration. And don't get me started with subscription razor services. The headaches those can cause. That's why you've got to meet Henson Shaving. Henson Shaving is a family-owned aerospace parts manufacturer that has made parts for the International Space Station and Mars rover. And now they're bringing precision engineering to your shaving experience. Razor blades are like diving boards. The longer the board, the more the wobble. The more wobble, the more nicks, cuts, and scrapes. A bad shave isn't a blade problem, it's an extension problem. By using aerospace-grade CNC machines, Henson makes metal razors that extend just 0.0013 inches, which is less than the thickness of a human hair. That means a secure and stable blade with a vibration-free shave. And it gets better. The razor has built-in channels to evacuate hair and cream, which makes clogging virtually impossible. Seriously, Henson Shaving wants to be the best razor, not the best razor business. That means no plastic, no subscriptions, no proprietary blades, and no planned obsolescence. The Henson razor works with standard dual-edged blades to give you that old-school shave with the benefits of new-school tech.
Once you own a Henson razor, it's only about $3 to $5 per year to replace the blades. My first shave with the Henson razor was incredibly refreshing. The design is sleek, the durability is top-notch. The Henson razor is truly so much better than your run-of-the-mill, quote-unquote, traditional razor brand. And the affordability factor is absolutely game-changing. No more wasting your money on expensive blades. With Henson Shaving, you can get a year of blades for $5. It's time to say no to subscriptions and yes to a razor that'll last you a lifetime. Visit hensonshaving.com/weekend to pick the razor for you and use code WEEKEND and you'll get 2 years worth of blades free with your razor. Just make sure you add them to your cart. That's 100 free blades when you head to hensonshaving.com/weekend and use code WEEKEND.
I'm Anthony Davis. We're with Max Burns. The Department of Justice has informed the former Vice President Mike Pence and his legal team that it will not pursue criminal charges related to the discovery of classified documents at his Indiana home. The department sent a letter to Pence's attorney on Thursday informing the team that after an investigation into the potential mishandling of classified information, no criminal charges will be sought. Surprise, surprise. I mean, well, we kind of could have predicted this. But meanwhile, and this is where it gets interesting, federal prosecutors investigating the disgraced former president Donald Trump's handling of classified material now are in possession of a recording of Trump from 2021 discussing a sensitive military document that he'd kept after leaving the White House. And this recording, I think, came about, it's made during a meeting that he had with people helping his former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, write a memoir of his 10 months in the White House. And it took place at the golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey, where Trump spends his summer. I mean, this is the kind of scoop that will enable Jack Smith to present actual audio evidence that will have Donald Trump banged to rights.
Yeah, this is a seismic development, and it's horrible for Donald Trump's case because on tape you have Donald Trump in his own voice talking to other people, knowingly dismantling all of the defenses Republicans have put forward for his conduct. He says that he has these documents. He wants to do something with them. He's never clear what that is, but he acknowledges that he can't do that because they're not declassified. And because he's a former president, he doesn't have the ability to declassify them. And for me, I think the scariest part was in this recording, CNN says, you hear at one point he's talking about the Iran invasion plans the United States made, and he waves around a paper. And no one's sure if he's actually waving around the Iran plans to this group of people or some other paper. But either way, it shows you not only did he have these, he had some plan to leverage them in some way and seemed frustrated that he couldn't find a loophole in how. That is exactly the case Jack Smith is here to prove.
When we first heard about the classified documents going missing, and then when the FBI did the search and there was that famous photograph of they'd been placed on the floor for the purposes of the picture, many of us were like, he is using those as leverage. Like, he took those things because he knew that he could either sell them to the highest bidder or use them to blackmail somebody. I mean, because that's who he is. I mean,
Yep.
you know, and every time he said, oh, I declassified them with my brain when I was president or, you know, while I was reading them or whatever, he's so obviously lying. He so obviously knows that he's been caught. And that's why he's trying to create this diversion, talking about Joe Biden having documents in Chinatown, like, you know, where they have very close ties with China. I mean, it's like, it's so outrageous, it's so ridiculous, and yet the media repeats it like it's factual. They don't even laugh him off the screen anymore, or they've ever done that. Take the wrong tactic with him. But the reality is that espionage is a very serious crime, and he just doesn't think the rules apply to him.
Yeah, and for many years they didn't. I mean, I can understand a sense of his impunity to have committed blatant crimes and to have gone through the Mueller investigation, which in a very different tack from the Smith investigation, didn't seem to actually do that much independent research. They largely relied on what was provided to them, Whereas Jack Smith has done the digging. He's brought in people from Mar-a-Lago. He's brought in people from Bedminster Country Club who were involved in moving boxes and taken their testimony. And what this really shows you is the underlying argument that Republicans have made to minimize this was, yeah, okay, he took some documents, but they're congratulatory letters from world leaders, correspondence he wrote. It is quite a different thing to steal United States battle plans, especially for one of our key strategic rivals in the Middle East. And the fact that he's openly talking in a clearly unsecured room to people who don't have security clearances about what he's got and how much he wants to use it should be a real national security threat, not just for Democrats, but for the few Republicans who still actually care about national security.
I maintain that he never really understood the magnitude of the presidency and what that was. To him, it was just another TV show. You know, he finished doing The Apprentice. Now he gets a job on this president show where he has to go into this kind of set of an Oval Office and just like make a few speeches. The guy is obsessed with the trappings. He loves being called Mr. President and Sir. But in terms of the importance of this high office, the most powerful man in the world, it's ironic that he loves power and yet he never really knew how to utilize that for the safety and security of the country.
Yeah, and that comes from the challenge in leadership of being able to appoint people around you who are as smart or smarter than you, who will challenge you and who will correct your missteps. Donald Trump has always viewed the presidency like everything else. It's a brand. It's a role you wear, a suit you put on. And he used to complain that the media didn't treat Barack Obama that way when he was president, because he views it as sort of being a role that allows you to act above criticism. You're the biggest guy in America, so you get to set the rules. And it's just not the way it is. We've seen other presidents in the past who have tried to fit more into the picture of a president than the actual functioning role of one, and it never goes well. But we've never seen one who is so contemptuous of actually having to do the work that he just preferred to leave it undone rather than even try.
I mean, he never filled, he never really filled department head off roles, did he? He kind of had all these open positions. I was amazed that for those 4 years that America managed to kind of stay open, considering that there was a very kind of lazy approach to and that's why he always used acting roles, didn't he? Because he didn't need to get congressional approval for them. And it just goes to show how much of the civil service is really run by civil servants, by people whose job it is to, push paper and make the country operate. And that even if the guy at the top is too lazy to really run it and appoint people, it can kind of still churn, albeit not very well.
Yeah, and Trump knows the power of his little coterie of people. Even though Trump is not an educated person on foreign policy or history or really anything political, he does understand the basics of how power works, which is you surround yourself with loyalists. You use, as you said, acting roles, so you can fire them whenever they tell you no, put someone back in who's more loyal, and keep churning them so no one is ever stable, no one can ever oppose you, and you're able to keep pushing. That's the roadmap for every developing country dictatorship we've seen in the 20th century almost. And he's very good at it. It's one of the reasons one of his biggest 2024 campaign pledges has been getting rid of the civil service entirely and essentially putting in a loyalty test to serve in government. I mean, that would be that would undo over 150 years of good government progress in this country. And he is deadly serious about it.
Remember that time where he was holding a cabinet meeting and he brought the cameras in and he made each and every one of them around the table tell them what they loved about Donald Trump?
Yeah, I could never forget. It burned into my eyes.
Well, do you remember also that the lights went off as well? There was a kind of moment where there was like a power cut or someone in the room leant on the lights and they all went out, which was almost a signal like this is maybe a bit too much. Maybe someone didn't lean on the lights at all, Max. Maybe someone pressed that button. Let's talk about Trump and DeSantis, because there is some serious, bitter rivalry going on at the moment. in this, as they're both starting to campaign for 2024, and DeSantis has been going everywhere. I mean, he went to Europe as well, but he's really trying to, push this. He made his official announcement a couple of weeks ago, and to say they are at each other's throats is an understatement.
No, it is a brutal fight. I think Ron DeSantis trying to model so much of his campaign on John F. Kennedy, weirdly, the international tour, the outfits that his family's wearing, the fights he's choosing to pick. But the truth is, it's not going great for Meatball Ron. He was at about 49% in the polls in January. He's at about 22% now. And everything we see indicates that all those DeSantis people went right back to Donald Trump. And the more people see Ron DeSantis, the less they're actually enthused about him, the less they actually feel he can go the distance, and he's at risk of becoming sort of a Jeb Bush kind of character.
Nobody wants to have to carry that mantle, surely. I mean, that's
a heavy cross
to bear. Man, I think a lot about, people have said to me, DeSantis is going to get it, and I'm like, you don't understand. Like, Donald Trump is the Republican Party. Donald Trump won't allow this to happen. Donald Trump, as long as he is alive, even if he's incarcerated, Republicans are Donald Trump and he is them.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yeah, on a very basic level. And it is, if you see the rise of Christian nationalism in the GOP, the number of Christian dominionist conventions at Trump properties, that line is blurring even more. The idea that Donald Trump may actually be a somewhat divine figure meant to save America is a huge undercurrent in the current Republican Party. It's one of the great fractures that hasn't really been talked about. And I've taken heat for saying this, but in my view, Donald Trump, there is no presidential candidate since Franklin Roosevelt in the Democratic Party that has had so much control over his voters, over their values, over what they identify as. The GOP is a brand attached to Donald Trump, not the other way around. And what he says is going to be the law. When you have 62% of Republicans in your corner, you can do pretty much anything you want.
I saw a photo on Thursday of one of these moments that you describe where he was seated with his eyes closed and everyone had their hands on him like he was the Messiah. And this Messiah complex that he has, I mean, it's very dangerous, isn't it? Because, to use people's or other people's faith, he clearly doesn't have any faith of his own, but to use other people's faith and to weaponize that is, it's very inappropriate. It's not something that should be meddled with. People's faith is very personal. And to kind of take on that mantle of being the second coming, or however he likes to think of himself, it's not healthy.
Yeah, it's distasteful enough just to make that statement offensive to billions of people, but also the language that comes along with it. Things they talk about, the sword of God, and this Christian dominionist language that essentially is meant to justify and excuse extreme or criminal acts. Because when you're working in the name of God to save America from the libs, that justifies a lot of really violent, really bad behavior. And Trump and the Republican Party, far from condemning that, are treating that as a green flag. They need those voters to win. So they're going to court them very aggressively. And if something violent does happen, they will excuse it.
What happened to the separation of church and state, Max? It's kind of a thing. What happened to that? Yeah,
Thomas Jefferson kind of fell out of fashion, I think. There was for a very long time, even up until the 50s, when we made the Pledge of Allegiance, this strong view that church and state not just were antithetical, but they didn't even mix very well. You got bad results when you put them together. The quality of the education and the quality of the religion suffered. But somewhere along the line, in the mid-'80s moral majority Reagan years, Republicans really realized that by clinging on to this grievance masked as Christianity, they could build a base that was impervious to a counter-argument because they felt that they were doing the word of God. So any argument on abortion, on race, on immigration was effectively saying God is wrong. And they've worked themselves into a corner where the only path is forward.
It's the start of Pride Month. It started on the 1st, a few days ago, and it's so unfortunate, isn't it, that there is this anti-LGBTQ plus rhetoric that we hear now in such clear language from Ron DeSantis, referring to wokeness as a mind virus, a woke mind virus. I mean, I just feel very sorry for people that are trying to just live peacefully and love who they love in this country when you have the leaders. It's not fringe people. It is the leaders, potential presidential candidates who are using this language to demonize anybody who is not white and straight and Christian.
Yeah, I've genuinely never understood why people run for president or run to serve this government when they clearly have such a deep hatred and resentment of the people they're meant to serve, that they don't seem to like the nation or any of the people in it. They think the values are wrong. They think that it would be better if it was a completely different, more authoritarian country, to the point where now there's no shame to it. I mean, you have party leaders in the GOP encouraging full-grown adults to skip work and go to Target and harass minimum wage employees because they have rainbow shirts for kids. And people that are getting banned from Target, that are then going back in, they're getting aggressive. I mean, there's only a matter of time until someone takes this to the fullest measure and actually harms people in one of these stores. And you can bet that when that happens, the right will find a way to spin it.
They hate the fact that gay people have been afforded the opportunity to live amongst them, despite the fact that there are so many gay people hiding in the Republican Party. And this kind of repression is so unhealthy for society as a whole. Do you think do they really believe these things? Or do they just enjoy hating on others?
I think it's honestly a distinction without a difference, because they're willing to put the stamp down when it matters. It doesn't matter to me if Nancy Mace really doesn't agree with abortion. If she's willing to pass a national abortion ban, it's the same thing. But the reality is there's a huge core of the Republican Party that does believe this, that believes it's their mission to go to Washington and clamp down on these social issues. I mean, we've seen Republicans say they'd rather their kids be dead than transitioning. We've seen Republicans say that the reason they want to end gay marriage is because the Census Bureau discovered gay married couples have a higher net worth than opposite-sex married couples. So their reason for opposing it is to really stick it to those gay couples that have gotten wealthy. I mean, this is purely victimization. There's no mask to it anymore. And what they want to say is that these people are okay to beat up on and to get out of our country. And Donald Trump is effectively saying that now.
I mean, I don't believe the country as a whole is like this, you know? I mean, if we were to talk percentages, I don't think that there's more than maybe 20% of people who are being misguided in this way. 30% of people maybe like Donald Trump, but are not as extreme as this. And if I was to make a prediction, I'm more interested for your prediction, but if I was to make a prediction, none of this homophobic rhetoric is going to be helpful at the ballot box. So if you were to kind of throw forward to November 2024, how is this going to play out? Will DeSantis still be there? Or is Joe Biden just going to see a landslide because these people have talked themselves into a loss?
Yeah. Well, remember, 30% is a lot of people when they all have 6 guns each. And they believe that Donald Trump is going to pardon them for murdering Democrats when he's president. So that enables a lot of extremism that normally a candidate would say, let's cool it. But for DeSantis, for example, his main problem is going to be money. He's lost several big mega donors. He's met with 5 or 6 recently who, after meeting him, have said they still want to play the field. For now, he probably has money to get through to Iowa and New Hampshire. But if he doesn't lock up some serious donors before then, it's really hard to show that he has the institutional support.
Okay. We have to finish. Time is upon us. But Max, thank you always. Very grateful for your thoughts, and hopefully come back again soon.
Thanks so much.
That's Max Burns. I'm Anthony Davis. You can subscribe to my new show. It's called MAGA Uncovered. It's with me and Ron Filipkowski doing that, uncovering the propaganda that MAGA is using to brainwash people. It's available here on the Midas Touch Network or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism on Patreon, patreon.com/5minutenews, and join me next week with a brand new special guest and 3 more factual news stories to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.